The sky over London did not simply darken. It fractured like a pane of glass struck by a sledgehammer, and the sound that followed was not thunder, but the shrieking of physics being violently rewritten. Smoke from the burning city below was already choking the stratosphere, where the Millennium organization's zeppelins hung like vultures, but the tear in the world ignored the war entirely, as it ripped open a void of pitch-black nothingness that made the night sky look bright by comparison. This was not the calculated occultism of the Nazi vampires, or the holy barriers of the Vatican, but a raw and jagged wound in the dimensional fabric that vomited out a pressure so dense it flattened the fires raging in the districts of Chelsea and Kensington. In the war room of the Helsing manor, Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates felt the cigar fall from her paralyzed fingers, as a sensation indistinguishable from drowning washed over her and forced the armed guards at the perimeter to their knees. It was a heaviness that bypassed the biological senses and gripped the soul directly. And for the lesser ghouls rampaging through the streets, the sensation was not fear, but an absolute command to halt. High above in the command blimp, the Major stared at the monitors, which were static with interference, and felt a vibration in his cyborg bones that he had not accounted for in 50 years of planning. The tear in the sky pulsed once, sending a shock wave that shattered windows for 3 miles, and then expelled a solitary figure that fell like a meteor toward the pavement. The impact did not create a crater of fire, but a crater of pure kinetic force that pulverized the cobblestones and sent cars tumbling like toys into the burning storefronts. Dust and debris hung suspended in the air for a moment, before slamming down under the weight of the arrival. In the center of the devastation, Ichigo Kurosaki pushed himself up from the asphalt coughing blood that evaporated into red steam before it hit the ground. His shihakusho was tattered and the heavy black blade of Zangetsu felt impossibly heavy in his grip, not because his strength had failed, but because the air in this world was thick with the screams of millions of dying souls. He blinked, trying to clear the vision of the Bankai precipice from his mind, but instead of the precipice world or the familiar streets of Karakura town, he saw a Victorian nightmare engulfed in modern flame. He sensed them immediately, not hollows, not arankars, not Quincy. The signatures surrounding him were wet and cold masses of predatory hunger that felt like corruption incarnate. A battalion of Leicester Battalion soldiers marched through the smog, their red eyes glowing with artificial vampirism, and they paused as they saw the Soul Reaper standing amidst the ruin they had created. They did not understand what he was. To their augmented sensors, he registered as a thermal anomaly, but to their stolen instincts, he registered as a predator that apexed above their food chain. Ichigo did not ask where he was. He did not call out for Urahara or Rukia. The sensory overload of mass slaughter triggered the oldest reflex he possessed. A soldier lunged faster than a human eye could track teeth bared to rip out the intruder's throat, and Ichigo moved not with a flash step, but with a brutal, terrifying economy of motion. The great black blade did not just cut the vampire, it obliterated the creature's torso under a wave of black energy that tore through the street and erased the building behind it. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that the war for London had just become a skirmish for survival. Ichigo exhaled, and the spiritual pressure spiked again, cracking the pavement beneath his feet as he looked at the monsters circling him and tightened his grip on the hilt. This was not his war, but the slaughter was familiar, and the instinct to protect was a curse he could never outrun. The board had been overturned and the pieces were about to be crushed. The dust from Ichigo Kurosaki's arrival settled over the ruins of the London street like a shroud of grey snow, mixing with the falling ash of the burning city to coat the cobblestones in a layer of grime that tasted of iron and old graves. He stood motionless in the crater, his breathing controlled and shallow, while his eyes scanned the perimeter with the hardened gaze of a soldier who had fought wars on the spiritual plane that human history had no language for. The Letzter battalion soldiers who had encircled him were frozen, not out of mercy, but out of a primal biological confusion, because their augmented senses were screaming conflicting data into to their brains. To their thermal optics, he was a roaring blast furnace of heat, but to their motion trackers, he was a ghost that flickered in and out of existence with every micro-adjustment of his posture. Ichigo tightened his grip on the cloth-wrapped hilt of Zangetsu, and the spiritual pressure radiating from his body condensed into a physical weight that pressed down on the chests of the vampires surrounding him. He could feel their souls. That was the first horror that clarified his situation. In the world of the living, or the soul society, or even Hueco Mundo, a soul was a distinct spark, a singular flame of identity that could be purified or destroyed. But these creatures were not singular. As Ichigo extended his senses, he felt a chaotic churning swamp of screaming voices trapped within the rib cages of the soldiers. They were legions of the devoured compressed into the shape of men, and their hunger was a void that pulled at the edges of his own spiritual integrity. One of the vampires, a stormtrooper with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jaw, broke the paralysis with a snarl that sounded like tearing metal and raised his STG-44 assault rifle. The weapon chattered a burst of high-caliber rounds directly at Ichigo's chest. The bullets struck an invisible barrier of reiatsu an inch from his skin, and flattened into lead pancakes before dropping harmlessly to the asphalt. The noise of the gunfire acted as a starter pistol for the rest of the squad. A dozen vampires surged forward, their speed exceeding human limits, moving as blurs of grey uniform and bared fangs. Ichigo did not panic. He simply stepped. It was not a run. It was shunpo, a step technique that folded space between 2 points. He appeared instantly behind the lead attacker, the heavy blade of Zangetsu, already completing a horizontal arc that had begun before he reappeared. The vampire did not fall apart immediately. For a split second, the creature continued its forward momentum before its upper torso slid diagonally off its hips in a spray of black fluids that were too thick to be blood. Ichigo didn't watch the body fall. He was already moving again, weaving through the chaotic melee with a precision that made the frenzied attacks of the vampires look like they were moving underwater. He parried a bayonet, thrust with the flat of his blade, the force of the deflection shattering the vampire's wrist and sending the rifle spinning into a burning storefront. A second vampire lunged for his throat, and Ichigo drove his elbow back into the creature's sternum with enough force to collapse the chest cavity and rupture the heart instantly. But as the bodies piled up, Ichigo realized the fundamental wrongness of this world. When he killed a hollow, the mask shattered, and the soul was purified, ascending to the soul society. When he struck these things, there was no purification. There was only silence. The screaming voices inside them were silenced, not freed. He was extinguishing existence entirely. The realization sat heavy in his gut, but he shoved it down because hesitation here meant death. Above the carnage, the Millennium airships cast long shadows over the burning metropolis. In the command center of the Deus Ex Machina, the Major sat in his chair, his glasses reflecting the static-filled feed from the street below. He was not smiling. The manic glee that usually defined his demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a cold, analytical intensity. The doctor typed furiously at a console, his gloved hands trembling slightly as the reading spiked off the charts. The energy signature they were tracking was not Alukard. It was not Anderson. It was something that defied the occult science Millennium had spent 50 years perfecting. The Major leaned forward, watching the pixelated image of the orange-haired boy tearing through his elite troops like a scythe through dry wheat. This was an anomaly, a variable he had not accounted for in the script of his great war. He picked up the radio microphone, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of deadly seriousness. He ordered the ground units to disengage and pull back to a perimeter of 3 blocks. He needed to test this new player. He needed to see if this was a man or a monster. Down in the street, the retreat was abrupt. The surviving vampires scrambled back into the shadows of the alleyways, leaving Ichigo standing alone in the center of the slaughter. The silence that returned to the street was broken only by the crackling of fires and the distant wail of air raid sirens. Ichigo exhaled a long breath of steam and swung Zangetsu down, whipping the black gore from the blade before resting it on his shoulder. He needed answers. He needed to know why the air tasted like sulfur and why the souls of the dead were lingering in the atmosphere instead of passing on. He turned his head, sensing a cluster of fading life signatures huddled in the ruins of a subway entrance nearby. Humans, terrified, injured. He moved toward them, his steps heavy on the broken glass. Inside the subway entrance, a group of London police officers and civilians were huddled behind a makeshift barricade of overturned benches and debris. They held their service revolvers with shaking hands, their eyes wide with the trauma of seeing their city eaten alive. When Ichigo stepped into the dim light of the station entrance, a sergeant raised his gun, shouting a warning that cracked with hysteria. Ichigo stopped raising his empty hand slowly palm open. He did not speak English fluently, but the universal language of non-aggression was clear. He looked at them, his brown eyes tired but devoid of the red hunger they had seen in the eyes of the monsters. He saw the wounded civilians behind the police line, a woman clutching a bleeding arm, a child staring blankly at the wall, an old man weeping silently. The protector instinct that defined Ichigo's existence surged to the forefront, overriding his confusion. He couldn't leave, not yet. He gestured to the street above, shaking his head to indicate it wasn't safe. The sergeant lowered his gun slightly, sensing that this boy with the giant sword was the only reason they were still breathing. But the respite was short-lived. From the darkness of the tunnel deeper in the station, a low growl echoed. It wasn't the disciplined march of the Millennium soldiers. It was the feral hunger of ghouls. The infection had spread underground. Ichigo spun around, facing the darkness of the tunnel. He could feel them, dozens, maybe hundreds. A mindless wave of hunger rushing toward the fresh meat of the survivors. He looked back at the sergeant and pointed firmly to the stairs leading up to the surface, then pointed to himself and then to the tunnel. He was staying. They needed to run. The sergeant understood. He barked orders, and the civilians began to scramble up the stairs past the Soul Reaper. Ichigo turned back to the tunnel, planting his feet. The first ghoul burst into the light, a shambling corpse with grey skin and empty eyes, and Ichigo didn't even blink. He released a pulse of Rajatsu so potent that the concrete walls of the station cracked. He wanted to draw them all to him. He wanted to be the brightest light in the dark so the moths would ignore the fleeing humans. And it worked. The ghouls surged toward him, a tide of rotting flesh. Ichigo raised Zangetsu high, the blade humming with the kinetic potential. He swung. A wave of blue spiritual energy, Getsuga Tensho, but restrained focused, ripped down the tunnel. It didn't explode. It dissected. The energy wave traveled for 300 meters, vaporizing every ghoul in its path and carving a deep trench into the trackbed. The tunnel went silent. Ichigo slumped slightly, the fatigue of the dimension jump catching up to him. He needed to find the source of this war. He needed to find whoever was in charge. Miles away at the Helsing Manor, Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates paced her office, the antique rug beneath her boots worn from the friction of her anxiety. The report from the field was fragmented chaos. The Vatican was moving. Millennium was burning the city. And now a new report from the Wild Geese mercenaries, stationed in the Western District. An unidentified combatant, sword wielder, high-yield energy output, neutral to civilians, hostile to Millennium. Integra stopped pacing and looked at the large tactical map on her desk. Ceres Victoria was currently pinned down near the tower, but she was the closest asset with the mobility to investigate. Integra keyed her comms. She ordered Ceres to disengage from the local skirmish and intercept the anomaly. She needed to know if this was a potential ally or a third apocalypse waiting to happen. Ceres Victoria, the Draculina, responded immediately, her voice tight with the strain of combat. She launched herself from the rooftop she was defending her shadow, forming a jagged wing that propelled her over the burning skyline. She could feel the energy source Integra was talking about. It was blinding. It felt like standing next to a star. It wasn't the cold void of Alukard, and it wasn't the holy fire of Anderson. It was something raw and turbulent. As she closed the distance, she saw the devastation. A street where the buildings had been sheared in half, not by explosives, but by a clean surgical force. She landed on a rooftop overlooking the intersection where Ichigo was currently standing guard over the subway entrance. She zoomed in with her enhanced vision. She saw a boy. He looked no older than her. He was wearing strange black robes and carrying a sword that looked more like a slab of iron. He was covered in dust and blood, but none of it seemed to be his. Ceres hesitated. Her instincts told her he was dangerous, but her humanity, which she clung to, desperately told her he was sad. She jumped down, landing on the pavement 20 meters from him. Ichigo reacted instantly, spinning around and bringing his sword up to a guard position. They stared at each other for a long heartbeat. Ceres raised her hands slowly, the Halkonnen cannon slung over her shoulder pointing at the sky. She shouted, asking him to identify himself. Ichigo frowned. He recognized the tone of authority, but he also recognized what she was. A vampire, but different. Her soul wasn't a swamp of screaming voices. It was singular, bright, struggling, and there was something else inside her. A shadow of something ancient and powerful, but currently dormant. He lowered his sword slightly, but did not sheath it. He asked who she was. Ceres blinked, surprised he spoke. She introduced herself as Ceres Victoria of the Helsing organization. Ichigo introduced himself simply as a substitute Soul Reaper. The term meant nothing to Ceres, but the lack of hostility was enough. Before they could exchange more information, a sudden oppressive pressure descended on the street. It was sharp, piercing, and smelled of old paper and dried blood. Ichigo felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked down the street. Walking out of the smoke and fog was a tall man in a grey trench coat. He wore glasses and held two long silver bayonets in his hands. A silver cross hung around his neck. Father Alexander Anderson of Iscariot had arrived. He had been hunting heathens in the sector when he felt the massive spiritual discharge of the Getsuga Tensho. He walked with a steady rhythmic gait, his face twisted into a smile that was equal parts devotion and madness. He looked at Ceres and sneered, calling her a Draculina. Then he looked at Ichigo. His smile widened. He didn't see a boy. He saw a heretic, a demon clad in the raiment of death. Anderson didn't ask questions. He didn't negotiate. He crossed his bayonets and recited a scripture, his voice booming with fanatical conviction. Ichigo sensed the danger immediately. This man wasn't a monster like the others. He was a human who had turned himself into a weapon. The spiritual pressure radiating from Anderson was sharp and holy, aggressive and uncompromising. Anderson lunged. He covered the distance in a fraction of a second faster than the vampires Ichigo had fought earlier. Ichigo flash-stepped backward, barely dodging the silver blades that sliced the air where his throat had been. Anderson didn't stop. He threw the bayonets, and they curved in the air, guided by his will and perhaps his faith. Ichigo deflected them with Zangetsu sparks flying as the holy silver struck the Zanpakuto. The impact jarred Ichigo's arm. These weren't normal knives. They were heavy with conceptual weight. Anderson pulled more bayonets from his coat, an endless supply appearing in his hands. He laughed a sound of pure joy. He shouted that he would purify the land of all filth. Ceres shouted a warning to Ichigo, telling him that Anderson was a regenerator and a paladin of the Iscariot Section 30, the Thiru. Ichigo gritted his teeth. He didn't want to fight a human. He was here to stop the monsters. He shouted at Anderson to stop explaining he wasn't with the Nazis. Anderson didn't listen. To Anderson, there were only the faithful and the monsters. Ichigo was clearly not faithful. Therefore, he was a monster. Anderson closed the gap again, swinging his blades in a flurry of silver arcs. Ichigo was forced on the defensive, parrying and dodging, using the length of Zangetsu to keep the priest at bay. He didn't want to use a Getsuga Tensho at close range. The backlash would kill Ceres and collapse the subway tunnel where the civilians were hiding. He had to fight with precision. He saw an opening and kicked Anderson in the chest. The priest flew back, crashing through a brick wall. But before the dust settled, Anderson was walking back out, dusting off his coat, his broken ribs already knitting back together with a wet, crunching sound. He praised the Lord for a worthy opponent. Ichigo realized this wasn't going to be a simple skirmish. This was an ideological war embodied in a fistfight. He shifted his grip on Zangetsu. He needed to incapacitate the priest without killing him. He gathered his Reiatsu, focusing it into his legs for a burst of maximum speed. He vanished. Anderson's eyes widened. For the first time, the priest lost track of his target. Ichigo appeared behind him, striking the back of Anderson's neck with the hilt of his sword. A blow meant to knock out a captain-class Shinigami. Anderson's knees buckled and he pitched forward, his vision swimming. But he didn't fall. He roared, driving a bayonet backward blindly. The blade caught Ichigo in the shoulder, piercing the Shihakusho and drawing blood. Ichigo leaped back, wincing. The priest turned around, blood flowing from his nose and ears, but still smiling. He was operating on sheer fanaticism now. Ceres leveled the Halkonen. She couldn't let Ichigo fight this alone. But before she could fire, the sky above them tore open again. This time, it wasn't a dimensional rift. It was fire. The Millennium zeppelins had triangulated the position of the battle. The Major had decided that the test was over. If the Soul Reaper could survive Anderson, he was a threat. If he died, he was a disappointment. Either way, the coordinates were locked. A barrage of V-1 rockets rained down on the district. Ichigo looked up. He saw the fire descending. He looked at Ceres. He looked at the subway entrance. He looked at Anderson, who was laughing at the apocalypse. Ichigo made a choice. He didn't run. He didn't attack. He planted his feet and pointed his sword at the sky. He screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that carried the weight of his resolve. The spiritual pressure exploded around him, forming a visible pillar of blue light that pierced the smoke. Bankai. The word was lost in the roar of the rockets, but the effect was instantaneous. The sheer density of his spirit energy created a dome of force. The rocket slammed into the Reiatsu and detonated prematurely. The street was engulfed in a firestorm, but inside the dome, Ichigo stood holding the sky up with his will. Seras watched in awe, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. Anderson stopped laughing, his expression shifting to one of genuine confusion. The smoke cleared slowly. The buildings around them were gone, flattened by the bombardment. But the subway entrance was intact. Seras was untouched. Even Anderson was standing within the circle of protection, his coat singed, but his body whole. Ichigo stood in the center. His appearance had changed. His sword was now a long, slender black katana. His robes were form-fitting and tattered at the edges. Tensa Zangetsu. He looked at Anderson, his breathing heavy, but his eyes burning with a cold, focused fury. He told the priest that if he wanted to fight, they could fight later. But right now, there were people to save. Anderson looked at the boy. He looked at the cross around his neck. He looked at the devastation caused by the Nazis. For the first time in his life, Alexander Anderson hesitated. He sheathed his bayonet slowly. He spat a glob of blood onto the pavement and told the heathen that God would sort him out eventually. But for now, the Judas priest had bigger prey. He turned and walked away into the smoke, heading toward the concentration of Millennium forces. Seras lowered her weapon. She looked at Ichigo. She asked him what he was. Ichigo didn't answer immediately. He looked at the black blade in his hand, feeling the vibration of the world around him. He said he was just a guy who couldn't ignore a crying child. He asked Seras to take him to her leader. He needed to know the rules of this war so he could break them. Seras nodded. She keyed her comms and told Integra she was bringing the package in. Ichigo Kurosaki had arrived in Helsing, and the war had just shifted its axis. But deep in the shadows of the city, something else was stirring. The massive release of spiritual energy from the Bankai had not just attracted the attention of the Major and the Vatican. It had woken up things that had been sleeping in the catacombs of London since the darker ages, things that were hungry for a soul as bright as the sun. And high above on the eagle, the no-life king Alukard smiled in his sleep, dreaming of a new game. Ichigo sheathed Tensa Zangetsu and followed the police girl into the night, the weight of the city's death toll pressing against his back like a physical load. He was a stranger in a land of monsters, but he had one advantage. He was the only one who fought for the sake of the living, not the glory of the dead. The alliance was formed in blood and fire, and it would be tested by horrors that Ichigo could not yet imagine. The timeline had fractured, and the path forward was paved with inevitable tragedy. Ichigo began to walk his steps, echoing in the silence that follows a massacre. He was ready, or so he thought. The Helsing organization's mobile command center was not a fortress of stone, but a convoy of armored steel moving through the subterranean service tunnels of London to avoid the aerial bombardment that had turned the surface into a kiln. Ichigo Kurosaki sat in the back of a troop transport, his Tensa Zangetsu resting across his knees, the black blade absorbing the dim flicker of the halogen emergency lights. Across from him, Seras Victoria sat with her Halkonnen cannon hugged to her chest, her eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion on the substitute Soul Reaper's face. The silence between them was filled with the rumble of the engine and the distant thud of artillery pounding the earth above. Ichigo was not resting. He was vibrating with a frequency of alertness that made the air around him hum. He was trying to sense the spiritual geography of this new world. In his home dimension, spiritual pressure flowed like water in a river, predictable and cyclical, but here it was stagnant and thick like coagulated blood. The souls of the dead were not passing on. They were sinking into the soil or being inhaled by the monsters that stalked the night. It was a spiritual ecosystem built entirely on predation. Ceres finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the tension. She asked him why he had spared Father Anderson. Ichigo didn't open his eyes immediately. He remembered the crazed priest's face, the absolute conviction in his madness. He told her that killing a man who thought he was doing the right thing wouldn't stop the war. It would only add another ghost to the pile. Ceres looked down at her hands, the vampire instincts inside her warring with her human conscience. She told him that in this war mercy was usually a death sentence. Ichigo opened his eyes and looked at her with a brown gaze that seemed centuries older than his physical age. He said that if they stopped acting like humans, they had already lost. The transport lurched to a halt. They had arrived at the makeshift headquarters, a reinforced bunker beneath the ruins of the British Museum. The doors swung open and the smell of ozone and stale cigarette smoke hit them. Integra Fairbrook Wingates stood at the center of the tactical map table, her silhouette cut sharp against the glowing monitors. She did not turn around as the heavy steel doors clanged shut behind Ichigo and Ceres. She took a long drag from her cigar and exhaled a cloud of blue smoke that drifted up into the ventilation fans. She demanded a report not from Ceres but from the intruder. Ichigo stepped forward, his footsteps silent on the concrete. He didn't bow and he didn't salute. He stood with the casual defiance of someone who had stared down gods and executioners. He told her his name and his rank as a substitute soul reaper. Integra turned slowly, her ice blue eye narrowing behind her glasses. She saw a teenager in tattered robes, but her spiritual sensitivity, honed by a lifetime of dealing with the occult, screamed that she was looking at a dormant volcano. She asked him what a reaper was doing in a war of vampires. Ichigo replied that he was there because the balance was broken. He explained that the souls in this city weren't dying, they were being erased or enslaved, and that was a violation of the laws of existence he was sworn to uphold. Walter C. Dornez, the angel of death, stood in the shadows, his microfilament wires resting loosely in his gloved fingers. He watched Ichigo with the calculated appraisal of a master assassin. He noted the way Ichigo shifted his weight, the lack of wasted movement, the way his hand hovered inches from his sword hilt. Walter stepped forward, offering tea on a silver tray, a surreal gesture of civility in the bunker. Ichigo declined politely. He wanted to know the enemy. He wanted to know where to cut to stop the bleeding. Integra pointed to the map. She explained Millennium, the Nazis, the Major, the 50-year plan to destroy England and plunge the world into eternal war. She explained that they didn't want territory, they wanted death for death's sake. Ichigo listened, his frown deepening. It sounded like the logic of a hollow but industrialized, organized. Then the shadows in the corner of the room began to bleed. The darkness did not just gather, it became liquid pooling on the floor and rising up in a mockery of a human shape. Eyes appeared, hundreds of them red and blinking in the gloom before coalescing into a tall figure in a red coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Alukard had returned. The Vampire King's presence hit the room like a physical drop in temperature. The air tasted of rust and ancient graves. Ichigo's hand snapped to his sword hilt reflexively, the spiritual pressure flaring around him in a protective aura. Alukard laughed a low rumbling sound that vibrated in the bones of everyone present. He ignored Integra and Walter walking straight toward Ichigo. He leaned down his face inches from the Soul Reapers. He sniffed. He recoiled slightly, a grin splitting his face from ear to ear. He said Ichigo smelled like death, but also like rain. He called him a contradiction, a thing that was dead but alive, a monster that pretended to be a boy. Ichigo didn't flinch. He glared back, his reiatsu grinding against Alucard's dark aura, creating visible sparks in the air between them. He told the vampire to back off. Alucard's grin widened. He asked Ichigo if he was a dog of the Soul Society or a wolf that hunted alone. Ichigo said he was neither. He was a protector. Alucard threw his head back and laughed maniacally. He mocked the concept of protection. He told Ichigo that in this world there were only the eaters and the eaten, and the man who tried to stand in the middle would be devoured by both. He drew the jackal, the massive black handgun leveled at Ichigo's forehead. He wanted to see. He wanted to taste the power that had stopped Anderson. Integra shouted an order to stand down, but Alukard pulled the trigger. The bullet was an explosive, armor-piercing round designed to kill tanks. It traveled at hypersonic speed. Ichigo didn't draw his sword. He didn't need to. He raised his left hand palm open. The bullet struck his hero the hardened spiritual skin he had developed through his battles with the Arangsa. The impact created a shockwave that blew the papers off the tactical table and shattered the light bulbs in the room. When the dust settled, Ichigo was still standing, his hand smoking but uninjured. The bullet lay flattened on the floor. Alukard lowered the gun, his eyes glowing with a terrifying delight. He whispered that this was going to be fun. This was the first strategic escalation. The introduction of a variable that could withstand the highest caliber of weaponry without flinching. But before the tension could escalate into a brawl, the tactical officer at the console screamed, "A breach, Sector 4. The enemy wasn't attacking the perimeter, they were bypassing it." The major sat in his command zeppelin, watching the feed from the bunker via a spyfly, a tiny mechanical insect clinging to Walter's coat. He had seen the bullet stop. He had analyzed the energy readings. The doctor stood beside him, trembling with scientific ecstasy. They realized the fundamental threat Ichigo posed. It wasn't his strength, it was his nature. The doctor explained that Ichigo's power was purification. If he killed the vampires with that black sword, he didn't just destroy their bodies. He severed the bond of the souls trapped within them. He erased the chaotic soup of life that Alukard and Millennium relied on. If Ichigo fought Alukard, he might permanently kill the no-life king by purging the millions of souls inside him one by one. The major stopped smiling. This was unacceptable. Alukard was the main course of his war. He could not allow an outsider to spoil the meal. He needed to remove Ichigo from the board, not by overpowering him but by breaking him. The major ordered the deployment of Zorin Blitz, but he gave her a specific modification. The doctor had synthesized a compound from the blood of Schrödinger, a quantum toxin that destabilized the perception of reality. They would not fight the Reaper's body, they would fight his mind. Back in the bunker, the alarms wailed. Zorin Blitz and a battalion of vampiric commandos had emerged from the sewers directly beneath a designated civilian shelter 3 blocks east. It was a trap, and everyone knew it, but it was a trap designed for a hero. Ichigo heard the location. Civilian shelter. That was all he needed. He didn't wait for Integra's orders. He turned and vanished the Shumpo, creating a vacuum that popped the ears of the tactical officers. Seras shouted his name and grabbed her cannon, rushing to follow him. Integra ordered Alukard to stay. She needed the trump card defending the command center. Alukard pouted, sinking back into the shadows, muttering that the boy would die if he was soft. And he was very soft. Ichigo arrived at the shelter in seconds. It was a converted underground parking structure reinforced with sandbags and prayer. But the scene that greeted him was a slaughterhouse. The heavy blast doors had been torn off their hinges not by explosives, but by raw strength. Inside, the darkness was alive with the sound of wet tearing and screaming. Ichigo stepped into the threshold, his tensor zangetsu, radiating a black light that illuminated the carnage. Zorin Blitz stood atop a pile of bodies, her side dripping with gore. She was massive, her skin covered in tattoos that seemed to writhe and move of their own accord. She saw Ichigo and smiled, revealing filed teeth. She didn't attack. She tapped the handle of her scythe on the concrete. The sound echoed with a strange, hypnotic rhythm. Ichigo raised his sword ready to blitz her. He was faster. He was stronger. This should have been over in one strike. But as he took the first step, the air shimmered. The smell of blood changed. It started to smell like rain. Cold, relentless rain. The concrete walls of the parking garage melted away. Ichigo stumbled his footing, suddenly uncertain. He wasn't in London anymore. He was on a riverbank in Japan. The grey sky poured water down on him, soaking his shihakusho. He looked down. He was small. He was a child. And holding his hand was a woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. Masaki Kurosaki. Ichigo's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew this was an illusion. His rational mind screamed that it was a trick. He tried to raise zangetsu, but his hand was small and empty. He looked up at his mother. She was looking past him, her eyes widening in terror. Behind him, the presence of the Grand Fisher loomed, a massive hollow masquerading as a lure. Ichigo tried to shout to tell her to run, but his voice was a child's whimper. This was Zorin's power, amplified by the quantum toxin the doctor had synthesized. It didn't just show images, it hijacked the neural pathways and forced the victim to relive their deepest trauma with perfect sensory fidelity. Ichigo was trapped in the loop of his greatest failure. In the real world, Ichigo stood frozen in the center of the garage, his eyes glazed over his sword point, dipping toward the ground. Zorin Blitz laughed silently. She gestured to her troops. She didn't order them to attack Ichigo. That would wake him up. She ordered them to finish the civilians. The vampires moved past the frozen Soul Reaper, mocking him as they went. They dragged survivors out of the corners, men, women, children, and began to feast. Ceres Victoria arrived at the entrance, breathless and terrified. She saw Ichigo standing like a statue while the massacre unfolded around him. She saw the purple haze of Zorin's illusion magic hanging heavy in the air. Sarah screamed Ichigo's name, leveling her halconin and firing a 30 depleted uranium shell at Zorin. Zorin deflected the shell with her scythe, the explosion rocking the garage but leaving the illusionist unharmed. Zorin turned her third eye toward Ceres. She intended to trap the police girl as well. Inside the nightmare, Ichigo watched his mother die. Again and again. The Grand Fisher struck. The blood splashed on his face. The grief was a crushing weight that paralyzed his soul. But this time there was a difference. In the background of the memory he could hear screams, real screams, not from the past but from the present. The voices of the Londoners he had sworn to protect. They were calling for help. They were dying because he was standing still. The dissonance between the illusion and the reality began to fracture the nightmare. His inner hollow zangetsu began to claw at the inside of his skull. Instinct, the hollow screamed. You are being eaten. Wake up. The king doesn't freeze. The king bites back. The rain in the vision turned black. The face of his mother dissolved into a skull. Ichigo's spiritual pressure began to spike uncontrollably. It wasn't the calm blue of his Bankai. It was a chaotic flickering red and black. The Reiatsu didn't just push outward, it weighed down on the illusion, crushing it with gravitational force. In the garage, the air around Ichigo began to twist. The concrete floor cracked in a spiderweb pattern beneath his feet. Zorin's tattoo stopped moving. She felt a spike of fear. The boy wasn't breaking the illusion with willpower, he was breaking it with sheer density of spirit. He was overloading the spell. Ichigo let out a roar that sounded like two voices overlapping. One human, one monstrous. The shockwave shattered every window in the remaining cars and blew the lesser vampires off their feet. The illusion shattered like glass. Ichigo was back. He saw the bodies. He saw the blood on the floor that wasn't there seconds ago. He saw a child's doll lying in a pool of red. He saw Sarah's pinned down by 3 vampires, her uniform torn, bleeding from a head wound. The failure hit him harder than any physical blow. He had hesitated. He had let his guard down, and people had died. This strategic escalation had worked. The Major had proven that Ichigo Kurosaki was not a god. He was a boy with scars that could be opened. But the Major had also miscalculated the reaction. He expected Ichigo to break. Instead, Ichigo hardened. The sorrow in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, bleak void of intent. He vanished. There was no sound of Shumpo, just displacement. He appeared in front of Ceres, grabbing the face of the vampire, attacking her, and crushing its skull into the pavement with a single motion. He didn't look at Ceres. He looked at Zorin Blitz. Zorin stepped back, her scythe held high. She tried to cast the illusion again. She tried to find the fear, but she couldn't find it. The mind she was trying to enter was no longer open. It was a wall of black steel. Ichigo raised Tensa Zangetsu. He didn't scream a technique name. He didn't pose. He simply swung. The speed was beyond anything Zorin had data for. She tried to block, but the concept of blocking was irrelevant. The black blade sheared through her side, through her torso, and through the reinforced concrete pillar behind her. Zorin looked down, her expression one of confusion. Her top half slid off her bottom half. But Ichigo wasn't done. He spun, carrying the momentum of the slash, and unleashed a Getsuga Tensho point blank into the rest of the battalion. The black energy wave was different this time. It was jagged, violent, and uncontrolled. It tore through the garage, vaporizing the vampires and collapsing the entire eastern wall of the structure. The ceiling began to cave in. Ichigo grabbed Ceres and flash-stepped out of the collapsing tomb, appearing on the street above, just as the ground swallowed the shelter. He set Ceres down. She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. She had seen Alukard kill with cruelty. She had seen Anderson kill with zeal, but she had never seen killing this efficient and this devoid of emotion. Ichigo stood looking at the rubble. He was trembling, not from fear, but from rage. He had saved Ceres, but the 42 civilians in the shelter were dead. He could feel their souls fading out, confused and terrified. He had failed. The Major's voice crackled over the city's loudspeaker system, interrupting the silence. He was broadcasting from the zeppelin. He welcomed Ichigo to the war. He congratulated him on his survival, but noted the collateral damage. He asked the boy how it felt to be a weapon that could cut anything but save nothing. Ichigo didn't answer. He gripped his sword until his knuckles turned white. He looked up at the zeppelins hanging in the sky like swollen ticks. He understood now. This wasn't a fight against hollows, where protecting one person was a victory. This was total war, and in total war, the moral high ground was a grave. Ceres reached out and touched his arm. She felt the heat radiating from him. She told him they needed to move. Reinforcements were coming. Ichigo nodded slowly. The first major catastrophe was not the loss of the city or the destruction of the Helsing HQ. It was the loss of Ichigo's belief that he could save everyone without getting his hands dirty. He turned to Saras, his voice flat. He asked her to take him back to Integra. He said he was done playing defense. If they wanted a monster, he would show them why even the hollows feared the moon. He sheathed his sword, the click of the guard echoing like a closing coffin lid. Ichigo walking back into the darkness, not as a shining hero, but as a grim soldier who had just learned the cost of hesitation. The war had just claimed its first piece of his soul. The heavy steel doors of the Hellsing command bunker did not creak. They groaned under the weight of the pressure differential as Ichigo Kurosaki stepped back inside. The air in the room shifted instantly. Before he had been a curiosity, a powerful anomaly that radiated the heat of a rescue flare, but now he felt like a reactor core with the shielding stripped away. His eyes were shadowed, and the bright orange of his hair seemed muted by the layer of grey dust and pulverized concrete that coated his skin. Sarah's Victoria walked a step behind him, her usual frantic energy replaced by a somber quietness that mirrored the Soul Reaper's mood. She had seen him fail, and she had seen the cold brutality that followed the failure. Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates looked up from the tactical map, her cigar burning low between her fingers. She did not ask if the civilians were safe. The silence and the blood on Ichigo's hands were the only report she needed. Alukard sat in the corner, materialized from the shadows. His red fedora tipped low over his eyes, but his grin was visible, sharp and predatory. He was enjoying the smell of disappointment radiating from the boy. It was a flavor he knew well. Ichigo walked to the table and placed his hands on the metal surface, his grip tight enough to leave indentations in the steel. He didn't look at the map. He looked at Integra. He asked where the major was. His voice was low, stripped of the youthful inflection that usually defined him. Integra exhaled a plume of smoke and pointed to the largest zeppelin on the holographic display, the Deus Ex Machina. She explained that it was hovering at 20,000 feet, protected by an escort of vampire fighter jets and a barrier of flak that would shred anything trying to fly through it. Ichigo looked at the hologram. He calculated the distance. He calculated the spiritual density of the air. He told her he was going up there. Walter C. Dornes stepped forward, adjusting his monocle. He warned Ichigo that a direct assault was exactly what Millennium wanted. They had tested his defense against Anderson and his mind against Zorin Blitz. Now they were waiting to test his endurance against an army. Ichigo didn't blink. He said he didn't care about their tests. He said he was going to cut the head off the snake and end the war. Alukard chuckled a low sound like grinding bones. He spoke from the corner, telling Ichigo that he was thinking like a human. He was thinking that killing the leader would stop the swarm. Alukard explained that this wasn't a snake, it was a virus. The major was just the carrier. But Ichigo wasn't listening to metaphors. He turned to leave, but the bunker's main communications array screeched with a piercing feedback noise. The monitors flickered and the image of the London map turned red. A new signal had appeared, not from the sky but from the river. The Thames was boiling. Hundreds of attack helicopters bearing the insignia of the Vatican Iscariot Section 20 were rising from the mist like a swarm of locusts. Enrico Maxwell had arrived, and he had not come to save London. He had come to purge it. The speakers in the bunker crackled with Maxwell's voice, amplified to a frantic screech. He declared a crusade. He declared that London was a pit of heresy and vampires, and that no one would be spared. The orders were simple: kill the monsters, kill the collaborators, kill the civilians who had been exposed, purge everything. Ichigo stared at the screen. He saw the live feed from a street camera. Armored crusaders were fast roping down into the residential districts, dragging people out of their homes and executing them in the street. These weren't vampires. They were humans killing humans in the name of God. The moral clarity Ichigo had been trying to find shattered completely. He looked at Integra. She was pale, her jaw set in a line of fury. This was the betrayal she had feared. The Vatican had waited for Helsing and Millennium to bleed each other dry, and now they were sweeping the board. Ichigo felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't war. This was madness. He looked at his hands. He couldn't save everyone from the vampires, and now he had to save them from the saviors. The complexity of the battlefield had just spiked beyond comprehension. He couldn't just fly it up to the zeppelin now. If he left the ground, the Vatican would slaughter the remaining survivors. He was pinned. Alukard stood up, his form elongating and twisting. He told Integra that it was time to release the restraint systems. He wanted to go to the river. He wanted to meet the crusade. Integra hesitated for only a second before nodding. She ordered Alukard to engage the Vatican forces. Then she looked at Ichigo. She told him to go with the vampire. Ichigo recoiled at the idea. He said he wouldn't fight alongside a monster. Integra slammed her hand on the table. She told him he didn't have to like it, but he had to do it. Alukard would draw the heavy fire. He would be the lightning rod. While the Vatican and Millennium focused on the no-life king, Ichigo would be the blade that cut through the chaos to reach the objective. It was a strategy born of desperation. Ichigo looked at Seras. She nodded grimly. She would stay and defend the HQ with the wild geese mercenaries. Ichigo tightened his sash. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and vanished, using Shumpo to exit the bunker before the argument could continue. Alukard laughed and dissolved into a swarm of bats flooding out the ventilation shaft after the Reaper. The streets of London were a chaotic hellscape. 3 armies were now colliding in a grinder of flesh and steel. Millennium vampires were fighting Vatican crusaders, while Helsing remnants tried to hold pockets of resistance. Ichigo appeared on a rooftop overlooking the carnage. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and blood. Below him, a squad of Iscariot knights, clad in heavy armor and wielding flamethrowers, were torching a row of houses. A woman ran out screaming, only to be cut down by a hail of gunfire. Ichigo moved without thinking. He dropped from the roof, landing in the center of the squad. The impact cracked the asphalt. The knights turned their weapons toward him, shouting about heresy. Ichigo didn't draw his sword. He stepped inside the guard of the lead knight, grabbing the barrel of the flamethrower and crushing it with his bare hand. The metal twisted like wet cardboard. He kicked the knight in the chest, sending him flying through a brick wall. The other knights opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off Ichigo's spiritual pressure. He moved through them, a blur of black and orange, knocking them unconscious with precise strikes at the neck and helmet. He wasn't killing them. They were humans. Misguided, fanatical humans, but humans. This restraint slowed him down. He had to measure every hit to ensure he didn't shatter their spines. From the east, a wave of red and black darkness rolled over the city. Alukard had arrived. The Vampire King did not use restraint. He unleashed the familiar release level 1. The Baskerville Hound. A massive shape-shifting dog made of shadow and teeth erupted from his arm, devouring crusaders and vampires alike. Ichigo watched from a distance, repulsed by the slaughter, but acknowledging the distraction. The heavy weapons of the Iscariot forces turned toward Alukard, pounding the vampire with tank shells and holy missiles. This was the opening. Ichigo looked up at the zeppelin. He crouched, ready to launch himself into the sky. But he stopped. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't the cold of a ghost or the heat of a battle. It was the absolute zero of a void. He turned his head slowly. Standing on top of a lamppost 50 meters away was a man. He wore a heavy military greatcoat and a peaked cap pulled low. His face was obscured by the collar, but his eyes glowed with a pale, silent luminescence. He had no spiritual pressure. That was what terrified Ichigo. In a world screaming with Reiatsu and souls, this man was a black hole. He existed, but he didn't feel like he existed. It was the captain. Millennium's trump card. The silent werewolf. Ichigo realized immediately that this was not a random encounter. The major had deployed his bodyguard to intercept the bishop. The captain didn't speak. He didn't posture. He simply raised one gloved finger and beckoned Ichigo. The gesture was casual, insulting, and terrifyingly confident. Ichigo turned his body fully toward the new threat. He sensed that turning his back on this man would mean instant death. He flashed his step, attempting to bypass the captain and gain altitude. But he didn't move. Or rather, he moved, but the captain was already there, mid-air, blocking the path. Ichigo's eyes widened. This wasn't Shumpo. It was raw physical speed that defied aerodynamics. The captain lashed out with a kick. Ichigo brought Tensa Zangetsu up to block. The impact sounded like a cannon firing. Ichigo was blasted out of the sky, slamming into a church tower and crumbling the masonry. He fell into the nave, landing amidst the pews. He coughed, shaking the dust from his hair. His arm went numb. The physical force behind that kick was heavier than anything he had felt since fighting Kenpachi. This was pure brute strength, unenhanced by spiritual pressure, but perfectly condensed. Ichigo stood up, dusting off his robes. The captain floated down through the hole in the roof, landing silently on the altar. He removed his greatcoat, revealing a muscular frame clad in a sleeveless shirt. His skin was pale, his expression blank. He looked like a statue carved from marble and brought to life for the sole purpose of violence. Ichigo gripped Tensa Zangetsu with both hands. He knew he couldn't hold back. He lunged. The black blade sliced through the air, aimed at the captain's shoulder. The captain didn't dodge. His body seemed to mist over, shifting into a cloud of grey smoke. The sword passed harmlessly through the mist. Solidifying instantly behind Ichigo, the captain drove a fist into the Reaper's kidney. Ichigo gasped air forced from his lungs and spun around, swinging a horizontal slash. Again the mist. The captain was intangibility weaponized. He was a ghost that could hit you. Ichigo jumped back, gaining distance. He fired a Getsuga Tensho. The black energy wave roared through the church, disintegrating the pews and the altar. The captain stood his ground. He didn't miss this time. He caught the energy wave. With his bare hands, he dug his boots into the stone floor, sliding backward as the spiritual pressure burned against his gloves. But he tore the wave apart, ripping the Reiatsu in half with a gesture of dismissal. Ichigo stared. This enemy was incompatible with his understanding of combat. He was fighting a paradox, a physical tank that could turn into smoke and tear energy with its fingers. Outside the church, the war escalated. Anderson had engaged Alukard. The two monsters were tearing the city apart in their duel. The Vatican helicopters were firebombing the streets. Ceres and the wild geese were pinned down at the Helsing manor, fighting off a wave of artificial vampires. Ichigo could feel Ceres's Reiatsu flaring. She was afraid. She was overwhelmed. He needed to end this now. He needed to help her. The distraction cost him. The captain closed the distance in a heartbeat. He morphed his arm into a massive wolf's claw and raked it across Ichigo's chest. The hierro held, but the force threw Ichigo through the church wall and out into the graveyard. He rolled, coming to a stop against a tombstone. Blood trickled from his lip. He was losing, not because he was weaker, but because he was fighting on the enemy's terms. He was reacting, not dictating. The captain walked out of the church hole silently adjusting his gloves. He wasn't even breathing hard. Ichigo closed his eyes for a second. He felt the chaos of the souls in London, the screaming, the dying. It was a cacophony that drowned out his own thoughts. He needed silence. He needed power that didn't care about rules or physics or mist. He reached up to his face. His fingers brushed the hollow mask that had been manifesting in his pocket dimension. He hadn't wanted to use it. The air here was already so saturated with corruption that he feared what the hollowification would do. Would he lose control? Would the mask merge with the vampire souls? But he had no choice. The captain was preparing to lunge again. Ichigo gripped the empty air over his face. He pulled down. Black and red energy erupted in a geyser. The spiritual pressure turned heavy, toxic, and oppressive. The captain stopped. For the first time, the silent werewolf showed a reaction. His ears twitched. His eyes narrowed. The smoke cleared. Ichigo stood in the graveyard, the white bone mask with its jagged black stripes fixed to his face. His eyes were gone, replaced by glowing yellow irises with black sclera. The presence wasn't just Ichigo anymore. It was the predator, the king. The hollowification was complete. But something was wrong. The mask felt different. In the Soul Society, the mask felt like a suit of armor. Here in London, surrounded by millions of devoured souls, the mask felt like a magnet. The ambient death in the air was being pulled toward him, feeding the hollow spirit. Ichigo roared. It wasn't a human shout. It was a distorted, mechanized scream that shattered the windows of the surrounding buildings. The captain crouched, recognizing the shift. This was no longer a duel of martial arts. This was a battle of monsters. Ichigo vanished. The sound of the sonic boom arrived a second later. He appeared above the captain Tensa Zangetsu raised. The captain tried to mist, but the Reiatsu pouring off Ichigo was too dense. It disrupted the spiritual cohesion of the werewolf's transformation. The mist scattered and forced the captain back into solid form. The black blade came down. The captain blocked with both iron-hard arms, but the force drove him into the ground, creating a crater 10 meters wide. Bones snapped. The captain's left arm hung uselessly at his side. He looked at it with mild curiosity, before looking back at the masked reaper. Ichigo didn't give him time to analyze. He was on him, a flurry of black strikes. Each hit released a shockwave that tore up the graveyard earth. The captain was on the defensive, dodging, weaving, and using his regeneration to survive the onslaught. But Ichigo was faster now. The mask bypassed the hesitation. The hollow didn't care about human life or collateral damage. It only cared about winning. A stray Getsuga Tensho flew wide and obliterated a Vatican evacuation truck 3 streets away. Ichigo didn't flinch. The human part of him screamed in horror deep inside, but the mask suppressed it. Focus on the kill. The captain realized he couldn't win a contest of speed against this form. He shifted tactics. He began to expand his own shape. The werewolf transformation took over completely. He grew into a massive white wolf the size of a tank, his fur bristling like needles. He howled a soundless psychic blast that stunned the senses. He lunged his jaws, clamping onto Ichigo's shoulder. The teeth sank into the hierro, cracking the bone. Ichigo roared in pain and point-blanked a Getsuga into the wolf's mouth. The explosion blew them apart. They landed on opposite sides of the ruin. Ichigo panted his breath, rasping behind the mask. The mask was cracking, not from damage but from the strain of filtering the toxic atmosphere of the Hellsing world. He could feel the connection to Ceres fading. She was in critical condition. The Helsing manor was burning. Alukard was trapped in a river of holy fire by Anderson. The board was collapsing. The Major watched from his zeppelin, sipping a glass of wine. He was delighted. The data was exquisite. The Soul Reaper had been forced to become a monster to fight monsters. The moral high ground was gone. Now it was just a dogfight. The Major spoke to the doctor, telling him to prepare the final stage. The Reaper was ripe for harvesting. Down in the graveyard, Ichigo reached up and ripped the crumbling mask off his face. It shattered into dust. He fell to one knee, exhausted. The power boost had been massive, but the cost was exponential. His Reiatsu was unstable, flickering like a dying bulb. The captain, back in human form but missing an arm and bleeding heavily, stood up. He didn't attack. He looked at the sky. A flare had gone up from the zeppelin, the recall signal. The captain nodded to Ichigo, a gesture of warrior respect, and then dissolved into mist, retreating toward the airship. Ichigo tried to stand to follow, but his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the wet grass. He had driven off the strongest soldier, but he hadn't won. He had just survived, and while he was fighting, the Vatican had encircled the sector. He heard the tread of boots, hundreds of them. The Iscariot survivors were closing in. They saw the boy who had destroyed their flamethrower unit. They saw the demon. They raised their weapons. Ichigo looked up, his vision blurring. He gripped his sword. He couldn't lift it. This was the chain reaction. By engaging the captain, he had exhausted his reserves, leaving him vulnerable to the swarm. He was alone, cut off from Integra, cut off from Ceres, and the crusade was ready to finish the job. Just as the first shot was fired, a shadow fell over Ichigo. It wasn't Alukard. It wasn't Ceres. It was a wall of cards. Sharp steel playing cards embedded themselves in the ground, forming a barrier that deflected the bullets. A figure stepped out of the smoke, dressed in a pristine suit holding a deck of cards. The dandy man, Tobulcane Alhambra. But he was dead. Alukard had eaten him. Ichigo blinked, trying to focus. The figure turned. It wasn't Alhambra. It was a projection. A shape molded from blood, and behind it the river of death flowed. Alukard had released level 0. The restrained souls were loose, but they weren't saving Ichigo. They were flooding the city. Millions of zombies, the armies of Wallachia, were pouring through the streets, washing over the Vatican forces and the civilians alike. Ichigo watched in horror. This was Alucard's true power. Not a gun or a dog, but an ocean of death. And Ichigo was drowning in it. The blood washed over him, cold and viscous. He tried to swim, but the souls grabbed at him. They recognized him. They recognized a Reaper. They wanted to be purified. They wanted to be saved. Thousands of hands grabbed his robes, pulling him down into the red tide. He screamed, but his mouth filled with blood. Ichigo Kurosaki, sinking into the river of death, dragged down by the very souls he was sworn to protect, while the city of London burned above him. The escalation was complete. The hero was not just defeated, he was submerged in the sins of the monster he had allied with. The timeline had shifted from a war story to a ghost story, and Ichigo was just another haunting. Darkness was not empty, it was heavy. The river of death was not liquid in the physical sense. It was a hyper-compressed sludge of memories, regrets, and screaming consciousnesses that weighed more than the crushing gravity of the deep ocean. Ichigo Kurosaki did not swim. He drowned in history. Every drop of blood that touched his skin transferred a lifetime of trauma directly into his neural pathways. He saw a peasant starving in Wallachia. He felt the cold steel of a scimitar slicing through a Turkish soldier's neck. He tasted the fear of a London police officer eaten an hour ago. The sheer volume of data threatened to overwrite his own identity. His ego, the concept of Ichigo, was a flickering candle in a hurricane of millions of dead souls who had been denied the cycle of rebirth. The voices were not hostile. They were desperate. They recognized the spiritual signature of a Shinigami, a purifier, a savior. They clawed at him, not to drag him down, but to be sent on to the Soul Society. They wanted the Konso. They wanted the hilt of the sword to touch their foreheads and end the centuries of darkness. But there were too many. To perform the ritual for one soul took seconds. To perform it for 3 million would take lifetimes. And in this dimension, time was a luxury he did not have. Ichigo opened his mouth to scream, but the blood rushed in tasting of iron and ash, choking him with the sins of Vlatepes deeply. Inside his inner world, the skyscrapers of Karakura town were flooding. The blue sky was turning red. Old man Zangetsu stood on the side of a building, watching the tide rise with a grim expression of resignation. The hollow Zangetsu, however, was laughing maniacally, hanging upside down from a flagpole, splashing his hands in the rising blood. King, he screamed. This is what we are. This is the food chain. You wanted to be a hero. Well, heroes are just the ones with the biggest stomachs. Eat them or drown. Ichigo heard the hollow, but he rejected the logic. He would not eat them. He would not become another Alukard, a container for the dead. He tightened his grip on his soul. He focused on the core of his being, the protectiveness that defined him. He couldn't save them all individually, but he could carry them. He could be the vessel that transported them out of the river, not by consuming them, but by shielding them. He expanded his Rei-Insu, pushing it outward not as a blast but as a skin, a barrier. The blood pushed back. The pressure was immense enough to crush a diamond, but Ichigo held it. He forced his eyes open in the physical world. The surface of the red ocean erupted. A pillar of black spiritual energy pierced the sea of ghouls, vaporizing the familiars in a 10-meter radius. Ichigo Kurosaki gasped for air, falling to his knees on top of a floating piece of masonry that used to be a clock tower. The city of London was gone. In its place was a lake of blood that stretched to the horizon, swirling around the few remaining structures like a crimson tide. The sky was a bruised purple, choked with the smoke of the burning capital. Ichigo looked at his hands. They were trembling. The black shihakusho was soaked in blood that wasn't his, and it wouldn't wash off. It had stained the spirit fabric, turning the black to a deep, dark maroon. He felt different. The voices were still there, buzzing in the back of his skull, a dull roar of millions of people watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He stood up. The weight of the river was gone, but the weight of the war had doubled. He scanned the horizon, searching for signatures. He felt Seras weak and flickering near the zeppelin landing zone. He felt the Major up in the sky gloating, and he felt the two titans in the center of the lake. A mile away on an island of debris, Father Alexander Anderson faced the monster Alukard. The scene was biblical in its devastation. Alukard was no longer a man. He was the castle. He was the army. He was the darkness spreading across the world. Anderson was surrounded by the Iscariot remnants, a few dozen priests standing back to back praying as the waves of undead washed over their barriers. Anderson held his bayonets, but his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization of his own obsolescence. He had fought monsters his whole life, but this was not a monster. This was a natural disaster. Ichigo moved. He didn't use shumpo. The air was too thick with the foreign reiyatsu for the delicate spatial folding. Instead he ran. He sprinted across the surface of the blood river, his spiritual pressure hardening the liquid beneath his feet into a solid track. He moved with the speed of a bullet, a black streak cutting through the red chaos. He had to stop this. He had to stop the escalation before there was nothing left to save. As he closed the distance, he saw Anderson reach into his coat. The priest pulled out a small glass reliquary. Inside it sat an ancient rusted nail. It looked innocuous, but to Ichigo's spiritual senses, it was a radioactive core of holy power. The nail of Helena, the artifact that pierced the body of Christ Ichigo, felt a wave of nausea just looking at it. It was a power that rejected everything else, a power of absolute singularity. Anderson's eyes were wild. He was shouting at Alukard, calling him the devil, screaming that if he could not defeat the demon as a man, he would defeat him as a storm of God. He raised the nail ready to pierce his own heart to transform himself into a divine weapon. Alukard watched with a bored, terrifying anticipation. He wanted Anderson to do it. He wanted a worthy opponent. He wanted to be killed by a human who had transcended humanity. This was the moment, the inflection point, the small choice that would fracture the timeline. Ichigo Kurosaki had two options. He could attack Alukard, joining forces with Anderson to suppress the Vampire King, potentially allowing Anderson to keep his humanity and fight another day. Or he could stop Anderson, because he knew instinctively that using the nail was suicide, not just of the body, but of the soul. Ichigo's code was absolute. He protected the living. Anderson was trying to die. He was trying to throw his soul into a furnace to forge a weapon. Ichigo couldn't let that happen. He couldn't watch another person sacrifice themselves for a war that was already lost. The memory of his mother, the memory of every time he had failed to save someone, surged to the forefront. He pushed his speed to the breaking point. The sound barrier shattered behind him. He wasn't aiming for the vampire. He was aiming for the priest. Anderson shouted Amen and drove the nail toward his chest. Suddenly, a black blade interposed itself between the artifact and the priest's heart. Metal rang against metal, a sound so high-pitched it cracked the glass of the reliquary. Ichigo stood chest to chest with Anderson, his hand gripping the priest's wrist, his sword blocking the path of the nail. Anderson froze his eyes wide with shock and rage. He looked at the boy who smelled of death and rain, the boy who was interfering with holy providence. "Get out of my way, heathen." Anderson roared, spitting blood into Ichigo's face. "This is the only way. This is the only way to purge the darkness." Ichigo didn't budge. He held the priest's arm with a strength that rivaled the captain's. "Don't do it," Ichigo said, his voice low and rough. "You're a human. Stay a human. If you use that, you're just another monster for him to eat, and I don't want to have to kill you too." Alukard's laughter died instantly. The Vampire King's face fell into a mask of cold disappointment. He looked at Ichigo with genuine hatred. For the first time, the amusement was gone. "You interrupted," Alukard whispered. The shadows around him began to boil. "You interrupted the climax. You stole the ending." Ichigo ignored him. He stared into Anderson's eyes, pleading with the fanatic to see reason. "Look around," Ichigo said, gesturing to the river of dead souls. "That's what happens when you give up your humanity. Do you want to join them? Or do you want to protect the people who are still alive?" Anderson hesitated. The fanaticism in his eyes wavered just for a fraction of a second. He looked at the nail, then at the boy, then at the monster. The logic of the battlefield told him to strike Ichigo to kill the obstruction. but the spiritual conviction of the boy was overwhelming. Ichigo wasn't protecting Alukard. He was protecting Anderson's soul. And that act of mercy into the middle of hell confused the Iscariot weapon. It was in this moment of hesitation that the massive outcome triggered. The choice to save Anderson was noble. It was the hero's choice. But in the Helsing universe, nobility is a tactical error, because while Ichigo was wrestling for Anderson's soul, he had turned his back on the sky. From the zeppelin, high above the Major smiled. He had anticipated that the Reaper would try to save the Paladin. It was in his psychological profile. The Major pressed a button. The Doctor pulled a lever, and from the clouds descended the Angel of Death. Razor-sharp microfilament wires descended from the smoke, silent and invisible, until they caught the light of the burning city. They didn't target Alukard. They didn't target Anderson. They targeted the anomaly. The wires wrapped around Ichigo's neck, his wrists, his ankles, and the blade of Tensor Zangetsu. The tension snapped taut instantly. Ichigo's eyes widened. He felt the bite of the wires cutting into his hero, threatening to sever his limbs. He tried to flash, step, but the wires were infused with a strange anti-spiritual alloy that disrupted his focus. He was yanked backward, violently pulled away from Anderson, and slammed into the ground 50 meters away. He struggled, but the wires tightened, digging deeper, drawing blood. Walter C. Dornez landed softly on top of a tombstone, his old hands manipulating the deadly puppet strings with effortless grace. He was young again. The transformation was complete. The Doctor's surgery had restored his prime at the cost of his loyalty. Walter the butler of Helsing had betrayed his master to fight his greatest rival. But Ichigo was in the way. Trash. Walter spat, his voice dripping with arrogance. You are a clutter on the stage, boy. I waited 50 years to fight Alukard. I will not let a substitute ruin the duel. Ichigo grit his teeth, straining against the wires. Get sugar, he roared, releasing a burst of energy vertically. The blast severed the wires, freeing him, but the distraction had been fatal. Not for him, but for the situation. Anderson stood alone, holding the nail. He looked at Ichigo, who was now engaging the traitor Walter. He looked at Alukard, who was looking at him with renewed interest. Anderson realized he had lost his moment. The boy had stopped him, and now the moment of divine intervention had passed. The doubt had crept in. The nail felt heavy and cold. He lowered his hand. The fire went out of his eyes. He couldn't do it. Not now. Not after seeing the boy fight so hard to save him. He fell to his knees, defeated not by the enemy, but by mercy. Alukard saw this. He saw the fire die, and he lost interest. The Vampire King turned his back on Anderson, dismissing him as broken. He turned his gaze to Ichigo and Walter. That is where the fun is now, Alukard said, grinning. The traitor and the stray dog, entertaining. But the strategic cost of Ichigo's choice became immediately apparent. By saving Anderson, Ichigo had neutralized the only force capable of holding Alukard in check. Anderson was supposed to be the sacrificial pawn that exhausted Alucard's level 0 form. Now Anderson was out of the fight, sitting broken on the debris, and Alukard was at full power with his entire army of souls still active, and Walter was attacking Ichigo. Ichigo was forced to defend. The wires came at him like a swarm of angry hornets, slicing the air faster than sound. Walter was a master tactician. He knew Ichigo relied on large swings and power blasts, so he used precision. He aimed for the eyes, the tendons, the throat. Ichigo parried with Tensor Zangetsu, sparks flying as the black blade met the wires. Why, Ichigo shouted, blocking a strike that would have decapitated him. Why are you doing this? You're her butler. You're supposed to protect her." Walter laughed a youthful, cruel sound. "I am the angel of death, boy. I serve the war, and my war is with Alukard. You are just a guest who stayed too long." Ichigo felt a spike of panic, not for himself, but for Integra. With Walter here attacking him, and Alukard distracted who was guarding Sir Integra, he looked toward the Helsing command post. The zeppelins' landing craft were descending. The major soldiers were swarming the position. Seras was there, but she was injured, and without Walter. Ichigo realized the magnitude of his error. He had tried to save the soul of an enemy, and in doing so, he had left his allies exposed. He shoved Walter back with a pulse of Reiatsu and turned to run back to Integra. But Alukard stepped in his path. The vampire king summoned the jackal and fired a shot that grazed Ichigo's cheek. "No running," Alukard commanded, his voice shaking the earth. "You ruined my duel with the priest. Now you are the duel. Fight me, or fight the butler. I don't care. But no one leaves the stage." Ichigo was trapped. To his left, the traitor Walter. To his right, the monster. Alukard behind him, the broken priest. And in the distance, the Hellsing organization was being dismantled. The major's voice echoed over the loudspeakers, announcing checkmate. He thanked Ichigo profusely. The Reaper's interference had removed the Vatican from the equation, without Alukard having to die. The board was cleared. The major announced that since the defenses were gone, he would be taking Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates into custody. She would be a guest on the Deus Ex Machina to watch the finale. Ichigo screamed a sound of pure frustration and rage. He raised Tensa Zangetsu high. His spiritual pressure exploded, turning the sky black. The blood river churned violently. He didn't care about the wires. He didn't care about the bullets. He cared about the promise he made. He charged, not at Walter, not at Alukard. He charged at the sky. He aimed for the zeppelin. But he didn't make it. Walter flicked his wrists. The wires caught Ichigo's ankle mid-air. The momentum slammed him face first into the street, shattering the pavement. Walter descended, landing on Ichigo's back, pinning him down. "Not yet," Walter whispered. "The finale hasn't started. You don't get to skip to the credits." Ichigo struggled, the Reiatsu flaring wild and uncontrolled. He saw the landing craft lift off. He saw the silhouette of Integra in the window, surrounded by Nazi vampires. She wasn't struggling. She was looking out the window at him. Her face was calm, resigned. She took a puff of her cigar and saluted him, a final order to survive. Ichigo stopped struggling. The wires cut into his flesh, but he didn't feel it. He watched the ship ascend. The failure was total. He had arrived to save the city. The city was destroyed. He had tried to save the civilians. They were dead. He had tried to save Anderson, and by doing so, he had doomed Integra. The logical cascade of his decisions had led to the worst possible outcome. This was the reality of the Helsing universe. Good intentions were just pavestones. For hell, Ichigo lay on the ground, the blood of the river seeping into his clothes. Walter stepped off him, adjusting his gloves, allowing the boy to stand. Alukard watched, smoking a cigar he had pulled from nowhere, crying tears of blood from laughter. "You see, now," Alukard asked, his voice mocking, but almost gentle. "You see why we are monsters? Because being human hurts too much. Boy, you tried to be a human in a world of wolves, and now look at you. You have nothing." Ichigo stood up slowly. His hair shadowed his eyes. The spiritual pressure around him changed. It wasn't the chaotic storm of before. It was quite cold. It felt like the bottom of the ocean. He gripped his sword. The blade was chipped, not physically but spiritually. The resolve was fractured. Ichigo looked at Walter. Then he looked at Alukard. He didn't scream. He didn't attack. He simply asked quiet and deadly, simply, "What do I have to kill to get her back?" Alukard smiled widely, exposing every sharp tooth in his head. Everything he said. "You have to kill everything. The army, the butler, the captain, the major. Me if you want to save the girl. You have to climb a mountain of corpses. Are you ready to start climbing, Reaper? Or will you drown?" Ichigo looked at the zeppelins retreating into the smoke. He looked at the broken Anderson weeping over his rusted nail. He looked at the ruin of London. He took a breath. The air tasted of sulfur and copper. He lifted Tensa Zangetsu, pointing it at Walter. "I'm not drowning," Ichigo said. "And I'm not climbing. I'm cutting the mountain down." The terrifying silence of a hero who has realized that mercy is a liability he can no longer afford. The timeline had shifted irrevocably. Ichigo Kurosaki was no longer a visitor. He was a combatant, and the rules of engagement had just been deleted. The duel between the Angel of Death and the substitute Soul Reaper began not with a scream, but with the high-pitched singing of microfilament wires slicing through the smoke-choked air of London. Walter C. Dornez moved with the desperate grace of a man who knew his borrowed time was burning out like a fuse. His fingers twitched, conducting a symphony of destruction, and the wires lashed out invisibly, shearing through the stone pillars of the ruins and aiming to dissect Ichigo Kurosaki into bloody ribbons. Ichigo did not block. He could not block. The wires wrapped around Tensa Zangetsu during the last exchange, proving that a static defense was a death sentence. Instead, Ichigo moved. He relied on the raw speed of his Bankai, pushing his physical body to the breaking point. He flickered in and out of visibility, appearing on the left, then the right, leaving after images that were instantly bisected by Walter's razor threads. The ground beneath them was reduced to gravel. Every step Ichigo took shattered the pavement, his spiritual pressure acting as a thruster to propel him out of the kill zone. He was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts on his arms and face where the wires had grazed his hierro, but his eyes remained locked on the traitor. Walter laughed a youthful manic sound that seemed wrong coming from the mouth of the old butler even in his rejuvenated body. He shouted that Ichigo was too slow, that he was fighting like a brute against an artist. He flicked his pinky finger, and a wire looped from the rubble behind Ichigo, catching the Reaper's ankle. Ichigo felt the bite of the metal and the sudden yank that threatened to sever his foot. He didn't panic. He spun, with the momentum driving the heel of his other foot into the ground to anchor himself, and unleashed a point-blank burst of spiritual pressure from his leg. The explosive release of Reiatsu disrupted the wire's tension, snapping the control and freeing him. Ichigo didn't retreat. He lunged forward, closing the gap before Walter could reset his weave. Tensa Zangetsu hummed a pitch-black note of death. Ichigo swung. Walter leaned back the blade, passing millimeters from his nose, cutting a few strands of his dark hair. The wind pressure from the swing blew the windows out of the building across the street. Walter danced back, his eyes wide, with a mix of fear and exhilaration. He was dying. The doctor's surgery was tearing his body apart from the inside out. He coughed, and blood sprayed onto his pristine vest. Ichigo saw it. He saw the tremble in Walter's hands. He stopped his pursuit, lowering his sword slightly. "You're dying," Ichigo said, his voice flat amidst the roar of the burning city. "You're killing yourself just to beat me." Walter wiped the blood from his mouth and smiled a rictus of pride and madness. "That is the point, boy. To shine brightly before the end. To be the Reaper who kills the Reaper." He attacked again more ferociously, this time abandoning defense entirely. He wanted to take Ichigo with him. Alukard watched from his throne of debris. his red coat billowing in the heat thermals rising from the fires. He was bored by the morality but fascinated by the struggle. He saw Ichigo hesitating. The boy still didn't want to kill a human, even a traitorous one. Alukard decided to force the issue. He couldn't let the finale be a tragic suicide pact between two side characters. He snapped his fingers. The shadows around the battlefield erupted. The familiar horde which had been idling in the river of blood surged forward. Thousands of ghouls, armored knights and Wallachian spearmen rushed toward the duel. They weren't attacking Walter. They were attacking Ichigo. Alukard wanted to see if the boy could climb the mountain. Ichigo sensed the tide coming. He looked at the swarm. He looked at Walter, who was preparing a final omnidirectional wire attack. He looked at the zeppelin hovering above, waiting for the victor. The situation was impossible. If he fought the swarm, Walter would kill him. If he fought Walter, the swarm would bury him. And every second he wasted, Integra was closer to death. Ichigo gripped his sword, his knuckles turning white. He needed a path. He needed a miracle. And in the Helsing universe, miracles were usually delivered by madmen. Alexander Anderson stood up. The Iscariot priest was battered, his coat torn, his glasses cracked. He had been sitting in the wreckage processing the fact that a heathen had saved his soul from damnation. He looked at the nail of Helena lying in the dust at his feet. He picked it up. He looked at Ichigo, who was now back to back with the traitor Walter, fighting off the first wave of Alucard's undead. Anderson closed his hand over the nail, but he didn't stab himself. He put it in his pocket. He drew his bayonets. They were chipped and dull, but they were still silver. He took a deep breath, inhaling the ash and the smell of blood. He walked forward. He didn't run. He marched. He began to chant not a scripture of wrath, but a psalm of protection. He walked into the sea of ghouls. He slashed left and right, his movement stiff but filled with a terrifying weight. He carved a path through the undead, reaching the center of the melee. Ichigo turned, surprised to see the priest. Anderson didn't look at him. He looked at Alukard. "You monster," Anderson shouted, his voice cracking but loud. "You want a show? I will give you a show." He turned to Ichigo. "Go." Ichigo blinked. "What?" Anderson slammed his bayonets together, creating a cross of sparks. "Go to the ship, heathen. Save the woman. I will hold the river." Ichigo looked at the priest's injuries. "You'll die," he said. Anderson smiled a genuine human smile that transformed his scarred face. "I was born to die fighting monsters. You were born to protect the living. Do your job so I can finish mine." Walter tried to intercept Ichigo, to stop him from leaving the stage, but Anderson threw a bayonet that pinned Walter's sleeve to a piece of rebar. The butler snarled, ripping his coat free, but the second of delay was enough. Ichigo didn't waste the gift. He looked at Anderson one last time, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. Then he looked up. He crouched, channeling every ounce of remaining spiritual pressure into his legs. The ground beneath him vaporized. Ichigo launched himself into the sky. He was a black rocket piercing the smoke layer, breaking the sound barrier in a vertical ascent. The wind tore at his clothes. The G-force threatened to black him out. But he kept his eyes on the Deus Ex Machina. Below him, the battle for London became a speck, a chaotic swirl of red and grey. He was leaving the earth. He was entering the domain of the Major. The Zeppelin was protected by a flak barrier of automated turrets. Thousands of rounds of high-explosive ammunition filled the sky. Ichigo didn't dodge. He spun Tensa Zangetsu in a tight propeller motion, creating a shield of deflection. He cut through the bullets. He cut through the steel plating of the ship's hull. He crashed into the interior of the Zeppelin landing in a long metal corridor lined with unsuspecting vampire soldiers. They raised their rifles, but Ichigo was already moving. He didn't stop to fight. He ran past them, his blade extending just enough to shatter their weapons and cripple their legs. He was a gale-force wind blowing through the corridors. He followed the scent of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. He knew where the bridge was. He reached the heavy blast doors of the command center. He didn't knock. He fired a Getsuga Tensho that obliterated the doors and half the wall surrounding them. Ichigo stepped onto the bridge of the Deus Ex Machina. The wind howled through the hole he had made, blowing papers and debris around the cavernous room. At the far end, behind a wall of bulletproof glass, sat the Major. He was drinking a glass of wine. Beside him stood the doctor, trembling in fear. And next to the Major's chair stood the captain. One arm missing, but his presence still as heavy as a mountain. Integra Fairbrook Wingates sat in a chair opposite the Major, her hands bound but her head high. She saw Ichigo enter, and her eyes softened with relief for a fraction of a second before returning to steel. The Major clapped his hands slowly. "Marvelous," he said, his voice amplified by the room's speakers. "Simply marvelous. You climbed the mountain. You rejected the tragedy on the ground to embrace the tragedy in the sky." Ichigo walked forward, ignoring the doctor, ignoring the captain. He stopped 10 meters from the glass wall. "Let her go," he said. The Major laughed. He explained that there was nowhere to go. The ship was rigged. The war was over. He had won. He had destroyed Alucard's kingdom. He had destroyed the Vatican, and he had proven that even a Shinigami could be dragged into the mud. Ichigo looked at the Major with cold pity. "You didn't win," Ichigo said. "You just made a mess." The Major's smile faltered. He hated pity. He signaled the captain. The captain stepped forward. This was the final obstacle. The werewolf had regenerated partially, but his arm was still a stump of twisted flesh. He didn't care. He locked eyes with Ichigo. There was no hatred there, only the professional acknowledgement of a soldier facing his equal. Ichigo raised Tensa Zangetsu. He was exhausted. His mask was broken. His Reiatsu was running on fumes. But he had one advantage. He knew what he was fighting for. The captain was fighting because he was ordered to. Ichigo was fighting because he chose to. They clashed. The impact shook the entire airship. The captain used his remaining arm and his legs, fighting with a savage, fluid martial art. Ichigo matched him blow for blow. The fight was short. It had to be. Neither of them had the stamina for a drawn-out duel. The captain went for a throat rip with his jaws. Ichigo sidestepped, risking a bite to his shoulder, to deliver a fatal thrust. Tensa Zangetsu pierced the captain's chest, destroying the heart. The captain froze. He pulled back, sliding off the blade. He looked at the wound. Then he looked at Ichigo. He nodded, a small, respectful nod. Then he burst into blue flames, turning into spirit dust before he hit the floor. The last soldier of Millennium was gone. Ichigo turned to the glass wall. He raised his sword to shatter it, but the doctor pulled a lever. The floor beneath Integra opened. It was a drop chute. She fell into the darkness of the ship's hold. Ichigo screamed her name and flash-stepped to the hole, diving in after her. The Major watched them fall, disappointed that the conversation was cut short. He turned to the doctor and ordered the self-destruct sequence. If he couldn't have the Reaper, he would burn him. The Zeppelin began to groan. Explosions rippled through the hull. Gravity failed as the engines died. The massive airship began to tilt nosediving toward the burning city below. In the bowels of the falling ship, Ichigo caught Integra in midair. He grabbed her, pulling her close to his chest, shielding her with his body. They slammed into a pile of crates as the ship lurched violently. Ichigo took the impact, his back slamming against the steel. He grunted, pain shooting through his spine. Integra looked up at him. "You idiot," she said, but her voice was shaking. "You should have killed the Major." Ichigo shook his head. "Saving you was more important." They were trapped. The ship was breaking apart. Fire was consuming the corridors. Ichigo tried to stand, but his legs gave out. The exhaustion was total. He had nothing left. He couldn't flash step them out. He couldn't blast a hole. He was just a boy holding a woman in a falling tomb. Integra realized this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her last cigar. She lit it with a steady hand. She looked at Ichigo. "You did well, Reaper. You fought a good war." Ichigo grit his teeth. "It's not over," he said. "I promised." He forced himself up. He forced his soul to ignite one last time. It wasn't spiritual pressure. It was life force. He was burning his own existence to fuel the power. The air around them turned gold. Not black, gold. The color of a pure soul. He wrapped his arms around Integra and kicked out a wall, blowing a hole in the side of the zeppelin. They fell. The wind roared in their ears. Behind them, the Deus Ex Machina exploded, a fireball that rivaled the sun. The shockwave hit them, sending them tumbling through the sky. Ichigo maneuvered his body, taking the brunt of the heat, taking the shrapnel, protecting the head of the Helsing organization. They crashed into the ruins of St. Paul's Cathedral, smashing through the dome and landing in the crypts below. The impact created a crater of dust and broken stone. Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. Minutes passed. The dust settled. In the center of the crater, Ichigo Kurosaki lay on his back. His shihakusho was in tatters. His sword lay broken in two pieces beside him. He wasn't moving. Integra crawled out from under his arm. She was bruised, covered in dust, but alive. She looked at the boy. She checked his pulse. It was faint, thready, but there. She slumped back against the sarcophagus, exhaling a long plume of smoke. She looked up at the hole in the roof, where the dawn light was beginning to bleed through. The night was over. The war was over. Outside, on the streets, the river of blood was gone. Alukard had vanished. In the final moments as the zeppelin fell, the vampire king had made his own choice. He had seen Anderson fall defending the path. He had seen Walter die of his own hubris, reaching for a star he couldn't catch. And he had seen Ichigo choose the life of one human over the glory of killing the enemy. Alukard had laughed. And then he had engaged the Schrödinger paradox. He drank the blood of the warrant officer who had slit his own throat in the chaos. He absorbed the concept of everywhere and nowhere, and he ceased to exist. The river vanished with him, taking the millions of souls back into the void. The Vatican crusade was broken, its leadership decapitated. Millennium was ashes. Ichigo stirred. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at the stone ceiling. He looked at Integra. "Is it over?" He whispered, his voice raspy. Integra looked at him. She looked at the ruins of her city. The cost was incalculable. Helsing was destroyed. Her butler was dead. Her vampire was gone. The city was a graveyard. But she was alive. And the boy was alive. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is over." Ichigo closed his eyes. He didn't smile. There was no victory in this. He felt the absence of the souls. He felt the silence of Zangetsu. He had cut the mountain down, but the mountain had fallen on him. The rescue teams arrived hours later. They found them in the crypt. The last Knight of Helsing and the substitute Soul Reaper. They didn't speak as they were loaded into the transport. There was nothing to say. The crossover had ended not with a triumphant fanfare, but with the quiet breathing of survivors who wished they had died. The timeline had corrected itself. The anomaly of Ichigo Kurosaki had altered the histories of this world permanently. Anderson died a hero instead of a monster. Walter died a warrior instead of a traitor in the shadows. And Integra lived to rebuild, but as the transport drove away through the grey morning fog, Ichigo looked out the window. He saw a shadow on a rooftop, a tall figure in a red coat. He blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, or perhaps a promise that in the world of Helsing, the monsters never truly leave, they just wait for the next war. Ichigo touched the broken hilt of his sword. He was ready to go home, but he knew a part of him would stay here in the blood and the ash forever. The story ended. The what if was closed. The reality remained. The rain over London had finally washed the red from the cobblestones, but the smell of ozone and sulphur lingered in the wet masonry like a phantom limb. 3 days had passed since the fall of the Deus Ex Machina, and the silence that had descended on the Helsing manor was heavier than the artillery barrages of the war. In the shattered remains of the formal gardens, a wooden gate of Japanese design stood suspended in mid-air, framed by 2 floating paper lanterns that glowed with a spectral white light. Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates stood before it, leaning heavily on a cane, her left eye bandaged and her remaining cigars tucked securely in the breast pocket of a borrowed military coat. Beside her, Sarah's Victoria stood in silence, her uniform crisp, but her eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran who had seen the end of the world and lived. Ichigo Kurosaki stood between them and the gate. He looked different. The tattered remains of his shihakusho had been mended with crude stitches, and his broken tensa zangetsu was sheathed on his back, the blade dormant and silent. He did not look like the roaring demigod who had challenged the sky. He looked like a tired teenager who had carried a mountain across an ocean. There were no grand speeches. The war had exhausted the capacity for rhetoric. Ichigo looked at Ceres and gave a small nod, a recognition of the monster she had accepted within herself to survive. She returned it a silent promise to guard the ashes of the empire they had saved. Then Ichigo looked at Integra. He didn't bow. He didn't salute. He simply offered a look of mutual respect that transcended the barriers of language and species. Integra exhaled a plume of smoke into the mist and told him that he was a terrible employee. She said he ignored orders caused excessive property damage and nearly got her killed 3 times. But she admitted that without his insubordination, there would be no London left to complain about. Ichigo cracked a faint smile, the first one she had seen on his face since his arrival. He told her to keep the monsters in check, because he wasn't coming back to clean up the mess again. The paper doors of the Senkaimon slid open, revealing the swirling vortex of the Bankai precipice world. A hell butterfly fluttered out confused by the heavy English air before retreating back into the spirit realm. Ichigo stepped onto the threshold. He paused for a heartbeat, looking back at the ruined city one last time. He wasn't leaving as a conqueror. He was leaving as a ghost that had briefly become solid. He stepped through and the doors slammed shut. The wooden gate dissolved into particles of spirit light, leaving the 2 women alone in the garden. Integra turned back to the ruins of her house. She had a report to write to the Queen. She had an organization to rebuild from the ground up. And somewhere in the void of non-existence, she knew Alukard was beginning his long count back to reality. She opened her logbook later that night, her pen scratching against the paper in the candlelight. She wrote the final entry for the incident. She did not record Ichigo Kurosaki as a weapon or an anomaly. She recorded him as a necessary storm. The timeline had healed, but the scar would remain a testament to the boy who taught the monsters of Helsing that even in the darkest night, the moon still watches. The book closed, the story ended, and the world continued to spin, waiting for the next war.